and welcome to Breast Cancer UK's Facebook Live. I'm thrilled to introduce you today to Anna Turns. Anna, you're an environmental journalist and a teacher of journalism, and you specialise in sustainability, writing about climate change, renewable energy, food and farming, just to name a few. And I'm really thrilled to be speaking to you today because you have recently published your first book, Go Toxic Free, Easy and Sustainable Ways to Reduce Chemical Pollution. And your book is on the issue that is actually very critical to us, very important to Breast Cancer UK, and that's the risk that chemical pollution poses to our health. So at Breast Cancer UK, we are very concerned about the links between chemicals such as endocrine disrupting chemicals and EDCs and the risk it poses to breast cancer development. So we actually spend a lot of time sharing tips with our supporters on how they can avoid these chemicals in their lives. So my first question to you, Anna, is first of all, can you tell me a bit about your background and also importantly, what initially led you to research chemical pollutants?
Of course, and thank you for having me. So way back when I was at university, I studied biology, and I've always been fascinated by how stuff works and the reasons for things and how everything's interconnected. And for the past 20 years, I've worked in the media, I've worked in television, radio, magazine journalism, a complete variety, often with a connection to wildlife programming, for example, or often food and drinks or provenance stories. And in the last 10 years, I've worked as a freelance, focusing on sustainability and really bringing my biology back into my work. A few years ago, I ran a campaign with my daughter, who was six, 7, 8 at the time, called Plastic Cover Salcombe. And it was a local campaign in our coastal town in Devon, all about reducing single-use plastic. And it was a really successful couple of years. We massively sort of shifted awareness of the problem, but it really made us realise that everyone was kind of focused on plastic, and there was obviously this other massive invisible pollution that no one was really talking about, and it got me thinking, how can we engage people in something that isn't as tangible as a plastic bottle or a carrier bag when they can't see it. And so I was really fascinated. I wanted to find out more about what was in those plastic bottles, for starters, and what happened when they were produced and the pollution that happened then, but also afterwards, once things were disposed of, what happened to chemical contents then as well. I've always been really fascinated by the psychology of positive change as well, in terms of trying to inspire people to improve things in an empowering way rather than a constricting, don't do this kind of message. So I was approached by the publisher to write this book, and it really appealed because it felt like it was a natural progression from my plastic pollution campaign, but also all of my writing is solutions focused. So it's looking at the positives. Although it is a scary subject, it's not a depressing book. It's very much about what we can do, and we can kind of take back a little bit of control and also use our voices to call for better change. So that's what really led me to it, in terms of developing that curiosity about all the hidden aspects of those supply chains. And I spent about a year researching the book and speaking to scientific experts around the world. And I think because I was a scientist originally as well, I felt it was quite important to translate some of that complicated science into really easy to understand stories, basically just top tips, like condensing things down into really succinct ideas, but it is all based on science. It's not opinion. It's kind of it's evidence based.
And your book does that really well, because that's one of the challenges we also have. And you know, listening to you there, we share a lot of, I suppose, your approaches. First of all, this concept of knowledge is power. Yes. You know, and how do you share that knowledge in a way that's accessible? You know, because it can be quite complex, this information. It's like a minefield, and a lot of people will react initially by saying, oh, how am I supposed to absorb? There's so many different weird names, you know, that chemicals often have. So breaking it down in a way that is understandable is so important and so positive. And also the other thing we share with you is this idea that it is about taking control and of your environment, of your health. And yes, as I said, you know, reading your book, it's enthralling, at times alarming, but reassuring because of the fact that, you know, there are so many things we can do.
Yeah.
So what did you want to achieve with this book, and what were the biggest revelations for you?
I think it's, as you say, knowledge is power. I think it's about lifting the lid on things that assumptions people make, things that people assume are correct because we're told them on labels, for example. So one of the first things I do in the book is I discuss greenwashing in quite a lot of detail in terms of how we can decipher what things mean and work out how not to be duped by marketing language. And that's really the first step, I would say, in terms of just really understanding if we're being manipulated and what we really need to be asking for in terms of greater transparency. But there are a few things that really surprised me along the way in terms of it. I think our perception can be quite skewed. Actually, some of the things that get a lot of airtime are things that are quite regulated. So things like cosmetics generally are really quite well regulated in Europe. Other things like nanoparticles, for example, that most people don't really ever consider, are not inherently bad. They're very, very useful. They've got very clever applications for medical devices, all those kind of things, drug delivery and so on. But there's so many that are used as non-essential added extras. So things like nano silver that gets added to period pants or sanitary towels or gym leggings as an antibacterial extra function. If I go to the gym, I'm not going to wear the same leggings again the next day. I'm going to put them in the wash. So it's not kind of saving me washing them. It's looking at that justification of things, and some things like those are excessively used when we don't know enough about the impacts those things have once they're in the ocean or in the soil or in our bodies. And also indoor air pollution often gets forgotten about. So a lot of the products that we are sold are packed full of fragrances, and actually clean homes need to smell of nothing, not lemon zest or sea spray or pine cones. It's just it's crazy. And I learned a lot about indoor air pollution in terms of all the particulates from cooking and lighting fires and all of those kind of things. And we think about city and traffic and busy roads as the source of air pollution, but actually there's a lot going on in our homes and within our four walls or wherever we live. We can change those things. We can kind of open the windows more while we're cooking and while we're sleeping, and change the things we're using in the home. But also the other thing that struck me was Silent Spring is a book that was written by an American environmentalist 60 years ago. It's the 60th anniversary this year, which it's really made me think that the conversation has moved on and it has evolved, but the problem has not got any better. The problem has got worse. The production of synthetic chemicals has skyrocketed, and we're not being any more precautionary than we were back then, 60 years ago. And I just think it's a bit of a wake-up call that we need to change the system. And although I don't think it is all down to individual action, I think we need governments and big business to make a massive difference. I think actually, a bit like you say, we have a voice. Together we can make a big impact by changing the things we buy or by lobbying for better transparency, all of those kind of things. So I really believe in the power of our voices and the fact that we can all have agency.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that we also believe very strongly, that everyone has a right to know, to understand, and to make an informed choice. And it's amazing, once we're informed, how much more confident we feel about what we think we need from our leaders and from our decision makers as well. So speaking of the public, how well do you think the public understands the risk of harmful chemicals, particularly to our health? I mean, you've talked about how, we've been talking about it for a long time, but how deeply do we understand it, and how concerned is the public in general about this?
I think there's a massive disconnect, and I think this stems back to what I was saying at the beginning about plastic. We can't see it, we can't touch it. It's not as easy to relate to, sort of psychologically. We don't kind of see something and then the impact isn't fast and acute. It's a long-term chronic thing. So it's actually very hard to compute that in our minds and to really kind of make those links and associations. And I think there is a lot that's misunderstood. I think there's a lot of chemophobia, so a lot of fear around chemicals that is unjustified. I see products that say they're chemical free, and you think, well, nothing is chemical free. Everything is a chemical. Chemicals aren't inherently bad. Yeah. We need them. Like my cup of tea is a chemical. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of, it's everywhere. But it's looking at it in a way that isn't full of fear, but also looking at it in a positive way. So green chemistry is this massive, growing, emerging field with incredibly innovative scientists making amazing things that will contribute hopefully to a more circular economy. They're designing out waste. They're making things that are all totally biodegradable, not just one ingredient is biodegradable, but the entire product is. Really exciting stuff. And I just think we need to tell those stories and show people that there's another way, and that just because our supermarket aisles are full of cleaning products with bleach in most of them and all of those things, that doesn't have to be the norm, and that there is another way. Because I think it's quite a skewed thing, isn't it? We go to the supermarket perhaps and see lines and lines of all these bottles and think, oh, well, everyone else must be buying these and they must be safe if they're sold in the supermarket, so I'm going to use them. And you think there's so many layers there of there are other options, maybe not everybody else is using them, and actually they're not safe. They've got a label on the back that says hazardous to aquatic wildlife and do not swallow and all of those kind of things. And you just think I think it's just through stories and through connecting people and places to these items in our home, we can feel more a sense of responsibility, I suppose. I mean, it's not all down to us, but a sense that we are citizens rather than consumers, and that we've got a duty of care. Everyone has a duty of care to this planet. And if we link up those dots, if we join those dots, we start seeing the big picture and imagining in your head the people who are tanning the leather and using quite toxic chemicals. And you know what I mean? It kind of, it's all of those things. So it's not about stopping doing everything and kind of inhibiting yourself, but it's just about really treasuring what we do have and thinking, okay, I'm going to make things last as long as possible. And if I'm going to buy things to put on my skin, I'm going to choose things that are biodegradable and not going to harm me and my family. And just taking that longer term approach, which is quite difficult, but I think there is a way of taking that fear away.
Yeah, it does feel as though it's a bit at odds with our consumer society where you know, we've got very good at consuming. We've got very good at finding what we need now for our immediate needs. So that kind of shift in how we think about what our needs are is part of, I suppose, making those choices and looking a bit beyond, you know, what do I need right now and how quickly can I get it?
Yeah, and I think like overconsumption is what's fueling the climate crisis. It's fueling chemical pollution. If we step out of that and move to a different framework where we think, oh, we don't have to buy stuff, I don't need that, so I don't need it. It's actually quite liberating. You'll save money as well, and it's just easier all round on so many levels.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What makes us unique at Breast Cancer UK is that we are a health charity, but actually we invest all of our research into the links between environmental chemicals and the risks of breast cancer, because we see research investment as really important, because we don't understand enough about the risks of harmful chemicals and how they affect our health. In your book, what evidence did you come across linking exposure to these harmful chemicals? And we're talking about, you know, harmful chemicals such as EDCs and other carcinogens. And so what evidence did you come across linking these chemicals to all sorts of diseases, including breast cancer?
There's a lot of evidence, but as with any cancer, it's really difficult to pinpoint a causal effect. It might be more of an association. So if you have been exposed to XYZ, you might be more likely to suffer from a particular type of cancer. So actually, scientists are looking at the more general population trends. It's really difficult, as I'm sure you understand, it's really difficult to say that particular thing caused that disease in my body, because there's so many variables happening throughout a lifetime. It's so complex. So I go through lots of various different research with different chemicals. One of the things that really hit home to me actually was the need to look at the nuances of the interactions. So we have, scientists call it a toxic cocktail, that we're kind of exposed to this mix of different chemicals, and we don't necessarily know how those interact. So if a chemical is present in and alongside another chemical, it might react differently. It might compound the effect, it might stop it, different things can happen. So that's one aspect, but also the changes in a human body. So often the menstrual cycle and pregnancy aren't necessarily taken into account in terms of how our bodies change. We might be more receptive to something at some stage of our life, or monthly cycle, for example. And so it's just massive. It's just a really complicated picture that we don't know enough about, and I would absolutely support any more research into this. There's an EU-funded program called FREIA, FREIA, which is looking into exactly this. So calling for more research, spending more time and money looking at how these different chemicals interact in terms of women's endocrine systems and how they develop throughout a lifetime. But in terms of other specific chemicals, so things like plasticizers, things like bisphenols are a real kind of problem area, partly because some, like BPA, have been tagged as carcinogens and endocrine disruptors, but also sometimes they are being replaced with what's known as a regrettable substitute. So they're being replaced, BPA might be replaced by BPS or a different bisphenol, which one day we might find that that's a big problem too, and then we'll move on to another. And so what often some scientists are calling for is a class approach. So you're looking at whole classes of things. So you're looking at all of the plasticizers and thinking, okay, is there a better way of creating safer chemicals that do that job that aren't related to those chemicals? And that's where the really exciting stuff is happening. Phthalates too, which you've probably covered a lot throughout your charity in terms of they're used as fixatives for fragrances, and they make plastics soft. Fragrance is something that I would try and avoid at all costs, because you don't have to disclose the ingredients of a fragrance, but it can include hundreds and hundreds of different chemicals, and some of them might be related to benzene, for example. There's just a complete array of things, and without knowing what they are, it's just not needed most of the time. It's just not essential. So it's a really simple way to streamline your toxic load by cutting out fragrances whenever possible, especially with babies and children as well. So you kind of look at all those fragranced nappies and all of those kind of things. You think, oh, just avoid.
You know, it's interesting you should mention bisphenols, because that's what our research funding is going towards this year, is looking at those regrettable substances, or the bisphenol substitutes, so the BPA substitutes, because yes, we share your concern, and we also think we need to spend a lot more research money looking very closely at those groups of bisphenols and the impact they have, obviously on breast cancer in our case, but also, you know, other diseases.
And also it's really interesting with the labeling. So often you'll buy like a plastic bottle that might say BPA free, and it doesn't say which bisphenols are in there. It doesn't say what is in there. So always look at, if something says it's free from something, try and find out what's actually inside it, because actually that's the information we want to know. So similar with parabens as well. Paraben free doesn't necessarily mean, oh, it's brilliant. Parabens themselves are not necessarily, I mean, there's a lot of debate around this, but the science that kind of created this media hype around parabens was actually really badly carried out, a really small sample size. It wasn't very robust science in terms of the actual experiment. And actually people I spoke to for the book said that some of the parabens, the shorter chain kind of molecules, are quite easy to degrade in your body, and you excrete them in your urine quite easily. And the things that they would be worried about would not be the parabens. It would be other things, like the things in fragrances and other chemicals. But it's often you get the kind of media hype about something, and then the marketing lingo comes in and hitchhikes onto that, and suddenly something can get blown out of proportion. when actually maybe we should be more worried about pesticides and they're not getting enough attention, or other things. So
yeah, and it's what gets cut through, you know, and I suppose it also depends on so things like PFAS, for example, they've become, I suppose, better understood because of you know, the quite high profile people involved in bringing it to the public attention. But as you say, there are lots of, in our case, you know, we're looking specifically at bisphenols because we are quite concerned about what the evidence around this grouping of chemicals is telling us. And so we see it as a priority because, you know, we don't have endless funds to, we'd like to cover all areas, but we've prioritized that particular area because we believe that a bit more research will give us more understanding of those links, yeah, and also give us the ability really to make a stronger case for the grouping argument as well.
Exactly. It just makes common sense, doesn't it? We don't have time. Like, for example, with the PFAS, it's about 8,000 chemicals. We don't have time to ban one, switch to another, wait, do the research, ban that one, move to another. We just have to only use them when they're really essential and when there's no other option. And otherwise, we switch to safer, greener alternatives that are becoming more mainstream.
Okay, so you, in your book and as part of your work, you went as far as to test your blood, but also your house dust for chemicals. And what did you find out?
So this was really fascinating. So I came across a professor who had created a body burden blood test. So he'd worked with UN on their Safe Planet campaign, which was all about biomonitoring. So it was looking at how these chemicals were in people, basically around the world. And they created this blood test and this kind of protocol that they did on about 100,000 people around the world. And it tests for about 100 different persistent organic pollutants. So POPs, we know them as POPs. Some of them have already been banned a long time ago, and some of them are newer ones. So some of them are PFAS chemicals, for example. And I interviewed him for the book and I said, oh, can I get my blood tested? It was really expensive. I had to send my blood to Norway to this specialist lab. And it took about 6 weeks for them to analyze it. And then I received this email with this very long PDF document, about 8 pages long, with all of these chemicals and concentrations and names that I didn't understand that just baffled me. So I got back on the phone to this lovely scientist and he kind of deciphered it for me and explained to me what this all meant. And most of them, he said, actually, most of them I'm not that worried about. He found things like PCBs, which are the synthetic industrial chemicals used in like cooling materials and electronics, that sort of thing. They've been banned a long time. And a metabolite of DDT, so the pesticide that was banned quite a long time ago, in low levels. So he said it's not alarming. The couple of things that he did flag up as curious, I suppose, like there was one pesticide called oxychlordane, which was banned in 1981 in the UK. I was born in 1980, so I was only 1 when it was banned. And he suggested that the exposure I received was probably not from being in a field near the spray while I was a baby. It was probably via the womb. So my mum had grown up in a farming family. She'd lived in the countryside. It was probably in the air, possibly. So it had got into her body. The interesting thing about this particular pesticide, which was basically used to kill insects on crops, was that each chemical has its own half-life. So the time it takes for its concentration to halve. And some, like I said about parabens earlier, they degrade really quickly. Their half-life is really, really short. With this oxychlordane, the half-life is 35 or so years. So it was still in my body 40 years later. I've no doubt passed it on to my children. And it's just a real wake-up call that bans work, but they take a long time to really come into effect because it stays in our environment, it stays in our bodies, it stays in the ocean, for example. And as soon as you ban something, it doesn't all just disappear. I mean, even PCBs, for example, there's loads of them still in landfill and all sorts of places. So these things don't just go away. A ban is essential, but that's not the end of the story. There's this ancestral impact, this sort of generational sort of hand down of chemical footprints. so that was a real wake-up call to me. It wasn't at levels where he said, oh my gosh, this is going to make you ill, you should be really freaked out by it. It was more just, this is the message that things stay, things last, and I mean, I might still have it in my body in another 35 years time. That's the kind of...
What you're suggesting is that you were born after a ban that didn't protect you from exposure, because your exposure likely happened in the womb, but then there's a chance also that your children have been exposed to it. Way after the ban. Way
after, and through no fault of their own. And I don't blame my mum either. But it's just that kind of story carries on. And there's been a really interesting research about DDT actually in California, looking at 3 generations. So the research has been carried on over 60, 70 years, looking at women in 3 generations of their family, and women who were exposed to DDT, so before it was banned, before they were pregnant as well, then went on to have children and grandchildren, granddaughters. When you are pregnant, you've got the eggs are within the baby already. So the kind of genetic material is already formed for your grandchild, basically, when you're pregnant. So they were looking at the effects of this DDT, and they found that even in the granddaughters of these women who had been exposed, they were still at greater risk of getting breast cancer. They had messed up menstrual cycles, they had higher risk factors that were putting them at greater risk, basically, of getting that disease. And it's just looking at that long-term picture that really kind of alerted me to the importance of shouting about this quite a lot. And the other thing that he found that were relatively high levels were the PFAS as well. He found them, and to be honest, I think wherever you look for PFAS now, you will find them. They're in the environment, they're in people, they're in drinking water, they're everywhere.
They've been in production now for many decades, haven't they?
And they're not being regulated enough. We're not applying that foresight to them as much as we should be. We should have learned from our mistakes, really. And I said to him, where could that be from? And he said, well, PFAS, they're in so many different products. They're in household products, everything from fabrics to cookware and everything. And he said, also, they're in a lot of firefighting foams, which are used in high concentrations at airports. And I said, oh, okay. I grew up 9 miles away from a really busy airport. And I said, well, could that be something to do with it? And he said, possibly, but it's just impossible to know kind of historically where that has come from. But that's one possibility, I suppose. So it was really, really eye-opening. And then I also had my house dust tested. So I'd sent a tiny sample of my dust from my Hoover bag off to a professor at the University of Birmingham to analyse it for flame retardants. So those are the synthetic chemicals that get added to things around our home. And he came back to me and said, actually, most of it was not very surprising. It was kind of as he would expect in a UK home. There were 2 different chemicals that he doesn't usually see in a UK sample. He said, oh, have you had anything from the Middle East or anywhere like that recently? I said, no, I don't have any rugs that have come from there. But I did have a wall hanging, actually, that my parents had bought me about 20 years ago in Peru, I think, that was being used as a rug on the floor in my son's bedroom. So obviously it was getting hoovered. And I did wonder whether potentially different flame retardants had come via that, and also car seats as well. So they are, if you hoover your car, they might not be in your home, but the chemicals inside of those, if they're made abroad and then imported, they might well have foreign unusual flame retardants in them. So he couldn't exactly pinpoint things because that's an impossible task, but there were a few suggestions for where those could have come from, and it was really fascinating, actually. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, insightful. You know, and as I said earlier on, a bit alarming, but it's good to understand what's there and then what you can do. And actually, in your book, you talk about the home, obviously, when you tested the dust in your home, and you focus on this aspect of domestic life a lot in your book. But how hard is it for us to go toxic free in our home, really? And what are some tips you can share with us for going toxic free, both in our home, but also in our everyday life?
So first off, I think your home is the kind of best place to start. You've got full access to it. You can dictate what's in it or what's not in it. And I think that's a really brilliant way to kind of start building this picture of which chemicals we have in our world, I suppose. I would say it's absolutely impossible to go toxic free. It's one of the first things I say in the book. It's a bit like going plastic free. It's kind of this aspirational idea that we can't ever completely achieve necessarily, but it's about improving things, and it's not about being perfectionists. It's about having that progress and starting that ball rolling, rather than going, oh my gosh, it's all too complicated, I'm not going to do any of it. It's just kind of do a little bit, like start with one little cupboard under your kitchen sink or your bathroom cabinet, or start with, if you've got to buy new sunscreen for yourself in the summer, like just take it really slow and don't feel overwhelmed by it, because it isn't about eliminating everything. It's always a way up of priorities, isn't it, for everybody? It's kind of a money thing, a time thing, a what's available thing. It's all of those things. But hopefully people can feel empowered to do better and demand better from other companies, leaders, businesses, etc. In terms of things I've changed myself at home, so I was already fairly eco, but there are definitely some things that I have really kind of taken on board and do differently. So following on from the house dust test, one of the things that the scientists explained was that electronic items often don't get dusted.
Yeah.
They have a lot of flame retardants inside of them, and if dust settles on them, those flame retardants are basically transferring to the dust. And then if the dust moves around, it might end up on the floor, your pet might eat it, your child might stick it in their mouth. It's kind of in your home. So one thing he suggested was, like, regularly, at least once a week, wipe down all of those electronic items. So things like your router, your Wi-Fi router, your DVD player if you've got one, all of those things that, to be honest, I hadn't prioritized that at all.
Oh.
There's more out of sight. So I've just kind of, I'm not obsessive about it, and I don't think anyone needs to be kind of really panicky about it. But when you are cleaning the home, just make sure you get all of that. Rather than spraying a polish as well, I would always wipe away with a damp cloth. There's no need for extra fragrance things to then get rid of dust. I would just keep it really, really simple. I do think cleaning products is a really good way to start, in terms of, we just don't need disinfectants, we don't need bleach. We can make really simple things that are made out of ingredients we find in the larder. So things like bicarbonate of soda, lemon juice, vinegar, all of those things. There's lots of recipes online.
So we'll be releasing some recipes as well as part of our prevention week. Yeah.
Amazing. And it doesn't have to be anything complicated. A little bit of elbow grease goes a long way. And if you do little and often, things don't get so bad, and you don't suddenly need the horrific oven cleaners or the drain unblockers and things like that. So yeah, so I've kind of definitely simplified my cleaning routine. What else have I done? I avoid fragrance products as much as possible in all areas.
People like to have a nice smelling home. So what's the alternative to fragrances?
You could use some essential oils perhaps, but open the window, just get some fresh air in, and bake some bread, put some coffee on.
Yeah. And plants as well. Plants are good, because they well, some of them can smell beautiful with flowers and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think once you do without those synthetic smells, when you do smell them, it's so much easier to notice them. Like, I go into a house, if I'm kind of, I don't have any at home, but if I kind of smell air fresheners and things, it hits home immediately, because it's almost like my radar is on high alert for them. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just really notice the difference. And in terms of other things, so when I buy items, I try and find things without those added extras. So without those nanoparticles, without the PFAS layers on. Things like waterproof clothes are really hard to find PFAS free, but you can find them. There are companies that make them. And yeah, just kind of really buying secondhand clothes is a great way as well, because obviously you haven't had that environmental impact with them. So buying a lot more secondhand. I eat a lot more antioxidant rich foods, so to kind of boost my own detox mechanisms in my body. So things like green leafy veg, blueberries, that kind of thing when they're in season. And the fruit and veg that my kids eat the most of, if I can get hold of it organic, I do, because I just want to reduce the number of pesticides they're being exposed to overall. It's not necessarily possible to get everything organic, because it might not be available, and it just depends really. But again, I don't go for perfection. I go for kind of the best I can do, and I think that's
the best advice, isn't it? And the best you can do, little things, little changes, which, you know, over time can become big changes. And I think that's what's the least overwhelming, because we all, you know, I'm the same, you know, there are lots of things in my house that I probably could do differently, but I've changed a few things and I'm happy with that. I've got used to that, and then I can change something else. It's been really lovely talking to you. Thank you so much for your time, for sharing your insights and your really fascinating research. Yes, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.